Well, I think singers can work on several things over the summer to improve. For one, as you see, I'm speaking on this microphone. I have kind of a little setup here, and I feel like we can start to work on getting our audio set up together. So that's something that singers can do. They can buy a nice microphone. They can buy an audio interface. I have a little light here happening too. I think having an online presence is really important right now, especially during the pandemic, where we're doing a lot of online teaching and a lot of online performances. I feel like we can kind of get the tech thing happening. So that's one thing I would suggest. In terms of something you can do musically or vocally, I would suggest to take the time right now to listen and transcribe other singers and instrumentalists. Taking, for example, a instrumentalist, a recording that you really like, and trying to sing that solo and learning the language of improvisation. I think we can take that time, especially now it's something we can do by ourselves. We can put in the time to sing along with these recordings, maybe even post them online. They have a thing called Jam of the Week on Facebook. Some singers are doing that, where they'll sing along with the transcription and post it for comments and feedback. That's something we could do. And then the other thing I would suggest is, if you don't already have some jazz piano skills, to learn some basic jazz piano skills. I think it's good, especially when we're kind of all hunkered at home and doing a lot of these solo performances, to learn some basic jazz piano skills so that you can learn to accompany yourself, even if it's just some basic 1-3-5 or root 7-3 kinds of voicings. Because we're doing a lot of these online performances, and then you can accompany yourself and don't have to rely on another musician. Wow, so I started very, very young. I was 3 years old when I started in music. I took Suzuki violin, which is a method where you learn by ear. So I was just listening to recordings and playing along on the violin. I had no idea what I was doing, but that's how I think music should be taught. It's a language. So just like any language, you just say something and they repeat it. And that's what I was doing with Suzuki violin. And my mom said I was progressing so quickly just by listening to the records and playing along that she wanted me to catch up with the reading. So I switched to piano when I was 5. And because I was kind of picking up some songs off the radio and different things on the piano. And I just love the piano because it just has so much harmony and melody and rhythm and everything. So even though I liked violin, it was a little limiting to me, and I just loved the sound and the chords and everything that I could get on piano. And then throughout grade school, I was playing in churches and playing for different shows and things like that. I started taking piano lessons from a neighbor, so I would go over before school at 7 o'clock in the morning every day. Not every day, once a week. And I would get up to practice before then, so I was pretty self-motivated as a young guy. My brother and sister didn't appreciate that when my brother was sleeping in the basement downstairs, and as I'm practicing upstairs. But yeah, so I got my start with that. My parents were both folk singers, guitarists and singers, and my grandfather was a jazz guitarist. So I have a lot of background of just being immersed in music in my family, and there was always jam sessions at our house and everything. So even though maybe I couldn't participate fully as a kid, I was listening to all these great folk tunes and jazz standards from my grandfather. Yeah, and I remember as a kid, we used to, we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and we used to, for fun, just like drive around the neighborhood. It was like a Friday night thing we would do, and we would just harmonize together. So we'd be singing these songs and singing in 4-part harmony or whatever, and it just seemed like a normal thing. It's like, doesn't everybody do this? Come to find out later, no, that's actually kind of unique. Well, when I was probably 12 or 13, one gentleman, he was actually a local piano player singer. His name's John Shea, and he lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan now. But I used to go listen to him with my grandfather, who's a jazz guitarist, and he used to take me to hear him play piano and sing with his trio at the Holiday Inn. And I just remember, because I was kind of just getting into some jazz and boogie woogie and that kind of thing in my classical lessons. My teacher kind of saw that I was interested in some other things, so I was doing some of that kind of stuff. And so John, on his break, said, why don't you sit in and play something? And of course, I didn't have much to play. I was just starting. But I did write some blues, and it was like one of those, like kind of like Louis Prima kind of things. Yeah. But, I got done playing, and everyone clapped, and he came over to me, and he said, "Hey, kid, you better be careful. You're going to steal my gig." Like that kind of thing. But so he was like my first local kind of influence in music. But at the time, Harry Connick Jr. had just released that album of When Harry Met Sally to the soundtrack of that. And I just loved his whole thing where he's playing and singing and these swinging standards and everything. So I really wanted to be like Harry Connick Jr. And then, of course, I started getting into Frank Sinatra because I was like, oh, who was his influence? And then got into Sinatra. And then from the piano perspective, I started listening to Oscar Peterson. And as soon as I heard him play, I thought, my gosh, this is how I want to play because it was so swinging and you could tell right away that it was Oscar. And I had this old cassette. I still remember. I think I might still have it somewhere. It was a tribute to the Gershwins, and it was a pretty accessible Oscar recording because if you've heard a lot of Oscar recordings, he's very pianistic. But this was kind of more simple or toned down. I mean, a lot of his solos were just playing the melody or very kind of eighth note lines. And so I loved that, and I could sing along with all the solos and everything else. So Oscar, but then I started getting into Red Garland and Wynton Kelly, and then Bill Evans and some newer players like Monty Alexander, and then there's a guy who's sort of protege of Oscar Peterson, Benny Green, who's around now, who I started really getting into his music. And then he said he was listening to Phineas Newborn, so I started getting into him. So anyway, it's this like kind of rabbit hole you go down once you start listening to people and then find out who they're listening to and check them out. And then, also vocally, of course, Chet Baker, because I really relate to other singers who are also instrumentalists. And I just heard Chet as a trumpet player first, and then I heard someone singing. I was like, who's that? And oh my gosh, that's Chet singing too. And he sang the way he played trumpet, which I thought was really interesting. And that's kind of how I approach singing, is kind of from an instrumental perspective. So he right away I really related to. In fact, I did an album of all of his tunes called Baker's Dozen. And then Mel Torme, of course, too, because of the scatting, and I just loved his tone and the Velvet Fog sound. And then a lot of female singers too, Sarah Vaughan and Ella, of course, and Carmen McRae. I just loved her bluesy sound. And so, yeah, there's been a lot. Of course, Nat King Cole was a huge influence as well, being a piano player singer. And he was somebody who my grandfather introduced me to as well. I remember my grandfather singing, Straighten Up and Fly Right, and those kind of tunes as when I was just a little kid. So all this stuff has been kind of just ingrained in my psyche all throughout my childhood. And so it was kind of a natural progression to become a jazz musician as an adult. Well, several things I'm working on now. As I mentioned, I've been working. This is kind of like my audio tech summer because I've had to do it. Everyone's kind of had to get their stuff together. So I've been doing a lot of kind of techie stuff, learning some Pro Tools, learning some Logic. I'm teaching at a couple schools this fall. I work at Cal Poly Pomona and Cal State Long Beach, and they're of course online. So I'm learning some of these different programs. Like one's called Soundtrap that you can do upload parts. Each student can upload parts and then kind of create a recording. And so it's a lot of kind of virtual things I'm learning that way. But on a musical level, I've been having a weekly meeting with a guy named Chris Anderson Bazzoli, and he's a film composer. And he's always kind of wanted to learn more about harmony, and I've always wanted to learn more about orchestration. So we've been doing kind of like a little trade-off where we just meet. And we both also kind of grew up with the music of the 80s and all those, kind of David Foster pop ballad kind of things. So we've been kind of taking some of those pop ballads and I've been sort of reharmonizing them, and then we're going to orchestrate them out, and could turn into a CD project, I'm not sure, but right now we're just kind of trying to learn from each other. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you all on jazzvoice.com.